Donald Trump becomes a prohibited possessor. Plus, the Supreme Court hands the NRA a unanimous free speech win. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. Stephen is, of course, the founder of thereload.com, where you can head on over and stay up to date on all things going on in guns in America. You can sign up for our free newsletter. But, the big news of the week, obviously, the sort of 800-pound gorilla in the room is some unprecedented happenings. Donald Trump was just convicted of 34 felony charges in his New York case and is now a convicted felon, the first time a former president has been convicted of a felony. And it's created all sorts of implications for the election, obviously, and for gun rights. You wrote a nice piece about what that might mean.
Yeah, I mean, unprecedented things happening all the time in our recent history here. So we get to enjoy another one. But I mean, the immediate takeaway, I think, from our perspective here is that because this, we cover gun politics and policy, is that Donald Trump can no longer legally own firearms once he's a felon, even though these were state convictions. They do trigger the federal felony gun ban. So, he was already in this situation where he couldn't legally obtain new guns because of his federal felony indictments. Which we spoke about actually back in October. We've kind of been talking about this issue for a little while, but it hasn't been much of a discussion outside of the Reload, really, which is something that I brought up in my analysis piece this week. This is something that was always a possibility, but got really little attention and conversation among both gun rights activists, the gun rights groups, and Donald Trump's Republican primary opponents. There's really very few people talked about this possibility at all, where now gun voters have the choice between somebody who can't legally own guns and somebody who wants to severely restrict gun ownership. So it's a pretty rough turn of events if one of your primary concerns is gun policy when you go, or guns when you go to the polls. And one that I think, whatever you think of these convictions or these charges or any of these cases against Donald Trump, certainly deserved more discussion than this when people were choosing who was going to represent essentially the gun rights movement in this election. So, look, we're going to talk with Gabriel Mailer, who's a federal appellate lawyer and also a legal commentator on the main show, about sort of the legal aspects of all this and what these charges mean for Trump and the fight over the felon in possession ban generally, and where that's at and how that could affect things. And probably even how Hunter Biden's gun charges, which, by the way, that trial starts on Monday. So we'll get more of these sorts of cases that implicate either of the two presidential candidates and gun rights once that case begins. But yeah, for now, I just think the politics of this, that really more the remarkable lack of attention to this detail, this eventuality, is what surprises me at the moment. That's what I wrote in the analysis piece. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I just think it is it bears focusing on the fact that the gun rights candidate, the champion of gun rights, endorsed by gun rights organizations, at least most notably the NRA.
Yeah, just 2 weeks ago.
Just 2 weeks ago, legally now has no gun rights. That's pretty staggering. And then, like you said, this is a lesser point, but his opponent, the champion of gun control, whose son, could very likely in the coming weeks also not have gun rights. So there's there's links to prohibited possessors on both sides of this election. It's just remarkable how much gun policy is sort of infecting the background of this case.
It is.
It's an interesting, I think you know, as far as gun voters go, you know, they might still say, you know, who cares? Our choice is clear. If we care about gun rights, one guy at least nominally at least speaks to what I care about in terms of gun rights. But there's something
the gun policy debate hasn't really changed necessarily. I don't think their positions are changed. Maybe, I don't know, maybe Donald Trump will become an advocate for challenging the felon in possession
the next
rule
plaintiff.
now. I think it's entirely possible. Maybe we'll get, we're living in a crazy world. Maybe we'll get a situation where, because Hunter Biden is being charged under the same basic law, this prohibited persons law as part of the Gun Control Act. There's a list of people who can't own guns or can't possess guns at all. And so what Hunter Biden is charged under is the same law that's going to keep Donald Trump from owning guns unless his conviction is overturned or unless that law is thrown out by the Supreme Court on a Second Amendment challenge. And there's some vague possibility that you could have a U.S. v. Biden case combined with a U.S. v. Trump theoretical Second Amendment challenge to this law by the former president. And that could be a Supreme Court decision. It's much more likely that other cases that are much further along than either of those will get there first. We already have a case right now that's pending, Rahimi, that's going to deal with this idea of dangerousness as part of the standard for barring somebody from owning guns. And then you also have range. And look, I don't want to get too deep into this because we'll get into it with Gabe, but range is about nonviolent felons and their ability to own guns. And so those will more realistically come up before Hunter or Trump's potential appeals to this point. But I don't know. It's a while. I don't think the gun policy positions of Donald Trump are going to change, or of President Biden. I mean, President Biden just the other day was tweeting about how we need an assault weapons ban. He's clearly sticking with that message. Trump made a lot of the same gun policy promises at his the May speech, where the NRA endorsed him, as he did in his February speech to the NRA in Pennsylvania. So I think if all you're going to look at is the literal policy positions of the two candidates, nothing has really changed on that front. But I mean, I think it'd be naive to say that the pro-gun candidate becoming a prohibited person has no effect on the potential political fallout.
Especially
that. Maybe
not,
maybe not a huge effect. Because we've seen this with Trump in the past. The scandals don't tend to stick, but this is obviously pretty different. And I don't know.
And it's especially, like you said, you pointed out in your piece, like he already had sort of a rocky relationship with the gun rights voter to begin with because of, some of his, the red flag law, support for the red flag law, vulnerabilities, some weaknesses on the gun rights side of things. And there were other alternatives that at least had stronger bona fide, like Ron DeSantis, you point out, I think you mentioned specifically in the piece. It's just interesting now to see he was already had some vulnerabilities to begin with, and now he's quite literally a prohibited possessor. And that's where the gun rights movement is sort of stuck with, is in terms of their champion for political office. So that's pretty remarkable, just politically.
It is. It absolutely is. And look, I understand that there are certainly going to be Trump supporters who think that's acceptable, that's just that they support. They would have picked Trump anyway, with knowing that this could happen, because they don't believe the charges are valid or what have you. Like there's plenty of reasons, or that they think he's still the best candidate to beat Joe Biden, or any number of arguments that people are like currently putting out as to why they'll still vote for him in the wake of this. I think it's the point here is much less about the convictions and what you think of them, and more about the fact that there was no discussion of this. This wasn't even something that came up as something to be debated during the primary, and it wasn't just that didn't come up from his primary opponents, who got sucked into the dogma became pretty quick in the Republican circles that everything Trump was charged with was illegitimate. And so it's surprising that none of them tried to really question that very much. And Nikki Haley kind of flirted with the idea later on in the race, really kind of after it was too late. DeSantis never really got into any of that. And they really, they also didn't do much on the policy side. You brought up there he had a lot of policy vulnerabilities to the right on guns. The bump stock ban, which is something the Supreme Court is right now considering the constitutionality of, which given that it's been narrowed down that one of the conservative justices is going to write that opinion based on how the court works. We talked about this, I think, last week. Who writes opinions is based on who's already written them for that month in the cases they had. And so there's only, a handful of the conservative justices left that could write the bump stock ban opinion, which means there's a good chance, not that we know this for sure, but there's a good chance that the bump stock ban is going to be struck down as unconstitutional. And then, of course, he had a lot of public comments about take the guns first, due process later. There was all these things that they could have gone after. Of course, he has a record that he can put out as a program record, appointing the justices, 3 of the 6 on the Bruin decision. Some of the stuff he did during the pandemic to designate gun businesses as essential businesses. He has things he could point to as well. But it's just remarkable that they didn't go after him on policy. They didn't even bring up the fact that he might become a prohibited person before the election, and leaving us in a situation where the pro-gun candidate can't own guns.
Yeah. No, it's like you said, it speaks to just all the missed opportunities along the way, or just oversights of discussions of guns really at all during the old primary, which we commented on it while it was happening, because it just was sort of remarkable to see a Republican primary where one of the main Republican issues was just left completely out.
I don't even think voters understand that this was a possibility. Not that they didn't understand it was a possibility he might get convicted of some of these charges, but that he would lose all of his gun rights and that he wouldn't even be able to own guns at that point. And clearly, if you go back to the Palmetto State Armory incidents where he was in October, where he was touring that store and somebody showed him a gun that had his face on it, and he said he was going to buy one. Both the campaign and the people showing him that gun clearly didn't even understand that he couldn't legally take possession of it, that he couldn't obtain guns at that point. Now he's not going to be able to even handle a firearm, on the campaign trail, or in his house, or wherever. And so that this got no attention at all is what's remarkable to me. It may well be, given how much of a hold Donald Trump has over the Republican Party and has for the last 8 years or so, that people would have decided this was acceptable and would have gone with him anyway. I'm not saying it necessarily would have changed the outcome of the primary or anything like that. It's just, there wasn't even really a discussion. And, you've even seen some of the gun rights groups have criticized Trump for his policy positions in the past. And some of the comments he's made, due process thing, gets brought up plenty by gun rights activists online. But none of them really touched on any of this at all. So it's a remarkable place for the gun rights movement to be, where this was not even a discussion, and now they're as by and large bought in to supporting somebody who can't legally own guns.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if it comes up as an issue sort of as the campaign moves further towards November, if that's a talking point for the Biden administration, or, it's tough to say with this election because it's just so unusual and atypical. But you'd think that could be, in a normal election would be a potential potent talking point, but this isn't a normal election. So we'll have to see how that plays out.
No, and it's, it's just one of these situations where, there's also the fact that guns is just not a top issue in the election. It's certainly the candidates have positions on them, and they've messaged on this a little bit, but it's not something that's gotten much of a front seat. And it's, even though there are clear implications for gun politics in his convictions, it's obviously unlikely to be the main thing or one of the top things that gets discussion, because there's so many other implications from him being a convicted felon, what the sentence is going to be, all this other stuff. So, I'm not confident that there's going to be much discussion of this fact that the pro-gun candidate in the race can't legally own guns. He's going to appeal, I'm sure. And, perhaps he'll win on appeal and the felony conviction won't stick and he'll get his gun rights back, or maybe, one of these other cases will restore them. But it's just I don't know that anyone would expect that this is where things are going to be if you go back, 2015 or whatever, that the Republican Party, the pro-gun candidate, would be somebody who can't who's a prohibited possessor, can't legally own guns.
Yeah, almost certainly not.
And nobody talked about it. No, it wasn't.
Yeah, no one mentioned one word of it.
It wasn't even a controversy in the primary at all.
Pretty remarkable. But one of the other major stories this week that kind of got nuked from orbit after this news dropped was we had a big Supreme Court ruling involving the NRA. The NRA got a massive win, a unanimous decision in the NRA v. Vullo case that allowed their lawsuit against the state of New York to go forward on First Amendment grounds. So not a gun case, but at least the NRA was involved, and it was a First Amendment win for them.
Yeah, and it was about their speech about guns. So, it's not a Second Amendment case, but it's still a gun case, I would say, right? And, it was against the former superintendent of the Department of Financial Services in New York, who had sent a series of letters and then had meetings with executives of insurance companies that worked with the NRA during 2018 on their version of concealed carry insurance, which was called Carry Guard. And the court unanimously found that the NRA has a valid First Amendment claim against her, right? Which is a big win for the organization that has been lacking for big wins for a while, right? So, it's a big PR victory for them. It did get kind of squashed by the Trump news, of course, as a lot of stories often do. But, I think it's something that sets a pretty good, it reinforces the court's First Amendment precedents here, and specifically speaks to them in regards to government officials trying to limit gun rights advocacy using sort of indirect means, if you will. The court, including all the liberals, in fact, this was all the liberals, and in fact, this was written by Sonia Sotomayor, the Obama appointee. And, I think that speaks a lot too. It wasn't just a unanimous opinion. It was also one written by one of the liberal justices. So that, I think, gives a really clear message from the Supreme Court on how they feel about the actions of Maria Vullo, who was the superintendent at issue in this case. And so pretty straightforward in terms of, she has effectively threatened these insurance companies with regulatory action or told them that she would go easy on them if they just dropped their relationship with the NRA. Some of the violations that they found of the Carry Guard insurance in New York, there were some actual violations with the way that those policies were structured, apparently. And, these insurance companies ended up having to pay fines, but above and beyond the violations, there was this pressure campaign from Vulo to drop the NRA and all what she called gun promotion organizations in the wake of the Parkland shooting, and other non-gun entities that had done very similar things, selling insurance without putting their name on insurance policies that were underwritten by insurance companies, and then selling that in New York is kind of one of the problems that the NRA had. But a lot of other groups do that apparently, and she was willing to say, we're not going to go after you for these other groups as long as you break ties with the NRA. And she was pretty explicit that it was because she didn't like the NRA's political views and didn't want them to be able to spread those views. And well, there's your pretty straightforward First Amendment violation, which the 9-0 ruling, I think, gives you a pretty clear case of that. However, I don't have a piece, should be coming actually over at CNN, on why, this was kind of a clear-cut case, but also is a fairly low bar, because this stage of the case that they're dealing with made it so that the justice had to assume what the NRA was claiming was true, right? That is one of the big caveats to all this. This wasn't a ruling on the merits. This was a ruling on whether or not the NRA plausibly pleaded a First Amendment violation. So the bar for evidence was quite low. They just had to offer up their pleadings in a proper manner. They didn't have to prove these claims, and some of the claims involved, backroom conversations that Bulla allegedly had with these insurance companies. So that may run into some issues on remand. That's what ended up happening here, that the court sent this back down to the Second Circuit and said it was really a slap down on the Second Circuit. So they're like, you have to ignore the things we've said about the First Amendment to get to this conclusion that she didn't even plausibly violate the First Amendment under these alleged set of facts. And yeah, ultimately, it's probably not going to be as big of a practical win for the NRA as it might seem at first glance. 9-0 unanimous ruling in favor of the NRA that says there was a First Amendment violation in what they claimed. That seems like the NRA is going to probably get a bunch of money back. It's a significant thing. And look, it is significant. I think the precedential aspect of it, saying that what she did was unconstitutional, is significant. But they might not even actually win the merits case. And that's not necessarily because they won't be able to prove that these conversations happened, although they will have to do that, is my understanding. But more because the other thing the Second Circuit ruled was that even if she did violate the First Amendment, she was protected by qualified immunity, because it's not well established that what she did was a First Amendment violation. And anyone who knows what qualified immunity is probably understands that the Supreme Court is a lot, I think, more willing to let qualified immunity claims stand than First Amendment violations. So it's very likely that when this gets back to the Second Circuit, that they're ultimately going to find Vulo, maybe she did violate the First Amendment, but it's not going to matter because she is protected by qualified immunity. And even if that doesn't happen, which, by the way, the Supreme Court could have taken up the question of whether she has qualified immunity, but chose not to in this part of the case. So another thing that perhaps suggests they're not going to intervene if that's how the Second Circuit goes again in the future. And I don't know why the Second Circuit wouldn't do that, because that was their part of their first ruling, that even if she did violate the First Amendment, she was protected. So, it doesn't, the odds there, I think, don't seem very good. But even if they get through those hurdles, I don't know how much money they can really get back for any of this. Maybe their legal fees. I mean, you're talking about somebody also who's not in government anymore. It's unlikely that, the NRA's insurance program, Carry Guard, is ever going to come back. All the people that operated that are not at the NRA anymore. And it would probably need to change a number of things to meet compliance with New York law. And I don't think there's any appetite inside the NRA to try it again, regardless of what happens with this case. So they're probably not going to get that as a revenue stream that they had once planned. It also, the whole Carry Guard thing just didn't go well from the very beginning, kind of every aspect of it. But anyway, so that's kind of the downside. This is a big symbolic win, a big PR victory for the NRA, but I think in practice, it's less clear how much they're going to actually get out of this when it all is said and done.
Yeah, no, that's helpful context, right? Like you said, it's a good PR win for an organization that sort of needs a PR win. But in terms of substantive victories, it seems a little more murky for them down the road.
It's not going to turn around their financial free fall, right? I mean, that's going to be something they have to do on their own through, which, they're trying. They've elected these reformers. We'll keep a lookout for what they actually put in place and how that works out for them. But I think that's, if anyone's counting on this Supreme Court win to turn things around for the NRA, I doubt that that's what's going to be the catalyst for it.
Yeah, I think that's right. Heading over to another story that happened this week, more gun politics type news. We had the runoff election in the Texas 23rd district, the primary, where incumbent Republican Congressman Tony Gonzalez was fending off a challenge from prominent gun tuber Brandon Herrera, known as the AK guy on YouTube. And it actually was a lot closer than I think a lot of outside observers were expecting. It really came down to the wire, but Gonzalez eventually did eke out a small victory and was able to hold his position in that race. But I think that was an interesting result of just how close it ended up being.
Yeah, it's really fascinating looking at where that came out. I mean, I think it's less than 500 votes that separated the two. So that's, I think, a pretty remarkable overperformance for Herrera from what people were expecting. They had the first round of elections in this case where Gonzalez couldn't get to 50% of the vote. So they had to go to this runoff, and Herrera was the second, but I think he only had 20, if I remember, he only had like 25%, 30% of the vote in that initial election. So it was a relatively hard case for him to get over 50, but he got real close, right? And what makes this race, this situation, didn't mean to rhyme there, sorry, particularly interesting for our purposes is that it really is the only race at the moment where guns was the absolute number one issue. I mean, that's the main reason that Herrera ran. Herrera is a gun tuber. He's I think he has like 4.5 million subscribers on YouTube, something like that. So he ran because Gonzalez voted for the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which did things like create this new background check system or procedure for 18 to 20-year-olds that essentially puts in a de facto waiting period for them, and how it works and how the FBI is allowed to take up to 10 days to even check for the additional records they're supposed to. And also expands the definition of domestic violence to include dating partners. So there were a few expansion of gun restrictions in there. There's also funding that could be used for things like red flag laws. That was included in Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, although that funding did end up making it so that states could use it on kind of whatever programs they want that might address gun violence. So, but regardless, that's the vote that kicked off this whole campaign that really got people upset with Gonzalez, and that got Herrera to run against him. So it really was a gun race. Now, it did morph into sort of a proxy fight between Republican leadership and kind of MAGA insurgents or MAGA hardliners, because you had, the Speaker of the House came out and campaigned for Gonzalez, and so did Governor Abbott of Texas. And then you had people like Matt Gaetz came out for Herrera. So it wasn't just about guns. It didn't end up being just about guns. And Herrera talked about border security. So this is a border district. Now it includes Uvalde, which was another sort of twist to it. That's sort of one of the remarkable things, is that Herrera got within 500 votes of winning in the district that includes Uvalde, right, where the 2022 mass shooting happened, running on a very hardline pro-gun platform. So that's pretty fascinating. I mean, that was kind of one of the warnings of the Gonzalez side, that he was too extreme and that he might lose the general election because it's something of a swing district in Texas. But nonetheless, it was pretty impressive that he got. I mean, he's an upstart. He's a first timer. He has a big public following, but he's never done a political campaign before. So, on the one hand, that's impressive, right? But there's obviously some other downsides, right? Some negatives you could look at.
I would say it kind of depends on which way you want to look at it, right? Because the fact that one, that, like you said, a political novice got this close to unseating an incumbent is pretty remarkable. But on the other hand, he didn't win, and it was about gun rights. Right. And you could say, well, maybe gun rights don't have the same potency amongst at least some primary voters that they used to. You could make that case as well based on how the results turned out. So I think it's interesting either way. Like you said, this was the one race that was it was pretty colored with gun rights. It was catalyzed by gun politics, and gun politics, obviously, because of who Brandon Herrera is colored the whole thing. So I think for that reason, it was just fascinating to see that outcome because it was such a gun focused race. Yeah,
it's hard to write it off one way or the other as this is obviously, you can't cross gun rights advocates because they'll primary, if you're a Republican, and because they'll primary you and you'll lose. I mean, he did get primaried and he almost lost, but he didn't lose.
Right.
So, and then at the same time, Gonzalez won. But first off, Gonzalez, he's a bit different than like Brian Fitzpatrick in Pennsylvania, the other Republican who. It's
a good point.
Is a gun control supporter, because Gonzalez voted for this bill, but I think he generally doesn't support other gun restrictions. He's against so-called assault weapons bans. He's not in the same camp as most Democrats are on gun policy, and he's not necessarily even the furthest left in the Republican Party on the issue. So, just to be clear on that, Herrera was clearly to his right, and that his vote on the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act is what triggered this whole thing. But just, he's not necessarily Fitzpatrick's been endorsed by Everytown. I actually asked Everytown because they were kind of bragging about him winning Gonzalez winning this runoff. And I was like, well, have you guys endorsed Gonzalez too? And they haven't. So he's not necessarily somebody the gun control people actually want to be in Congress. I would bet they're going to endorse his Democratic opponent in this election, but they're obviously enjoying, their political opponents in the gun rights movement losing that runoff. So, but just to be clear, he's where he is on the spectrum of gun policy support, but yeah, so him winning is not necessarily, some repudiation of the strength of the gun rights movement either. Gonzalez coming out on top by 400 something votes is not some sign that the gun rights movement has no pull left at least in Republican Party. Yeah. And in fact, I think we have another story that kind of encapsulates this point.
I was going to say, speaking of the lingering potency of the gun rights electorate, so one of the links in the newsletter comes to us from Bearing Arms, reporting about the fact that Tennessee Governor Bill Lee just signed a bill that essentially prohibits any locality in the state from adopting a red flag law or anything resembling a red flag law. And listeners may recall that Bill Lee made headlines last year after the Covenant School shooting because he came out ahead of a special session, essentially pushing for a red flag law. I mean, he called it something else. He was very careful not to call it a red flag law, but
kind of
he
a
was
pared down red flag law, yellow flag law, like they have in Maine, sort of situation.
He tried to paint it as it was sort of like a red flag law, but it has actual
he
due
really
process
he really
protection.
didn't want to call it a red flag law. That's for
yeah
sure.
Yeah. And then obviously that didn't end up going anywhere. He, actually energized a lot of gun rights advocates in the state. And to see, in a year's time going from actually sticking his neck out and pushing for something like a red flag law to then signing a bill, that's a pretty big sign that gun rights voters clearly got in his ear, or people, gun rights supporters in his caucus at least. So pretty big switch.
Oh yeah. And I think that again goes to the influence of gun rights activists within at least the Republican Party, is certainly in a place like Tennessee. Because he basically has now had to go the complete other direction from where he was after that shooting. And so, I certainly wouldn't look at Herrera losing by a couple hundred votes and imagine that it means the gun rights movement has no more influence in American politics. It's clearly not the case.
Right. And then the last link we want to hit before we wrap up here is also deals with red flag laws, but sort of on the other end of the spectrum. It's an interesting story from the San Diego Union Tribune that one details the fact that San Diego apparently uses more red flag laws than any other jurisdiction in California, which is interesting. But this particular article is about someone actually being convicted for violating a red flag law, which I think they say is the first time that's happened in the state. And the circumstances under which it happened were sort of weird, and maybe kind of speak to why some gun owners are skeptical of these measures. I don't know if you had the same reaction when you read the piece and the details surrounding it.
Yeah, so apparently, at least from the reporting that we have on this,
right?
The whole situation stemmed from neighbors who saw somebody shooting a gun and saw and heard somebody shooting a gun in their backyard, and then called the police. And the police came and got everyone out of the house and talked to the guy who was identified as being the one who was shooting a gun. And I think they even saw him holding a gun at some point. And he denied that he had any guns. So the police called a judge on the spot to try and get a red flag order against this guy, which was granted. And then he still refused to say that he had firearms. He refused to turn them over in the wake of that grant. And so they got a search warrant and went in his house and searched and found his gun. And they found like a orange juice jug that he was shooting at in his backyard. And it was a .22 gun of some type. He was shooting at an orange juice jug. Now, that may well be illegal to discharge a firearm in a populated area like that, and irresponsible even, depending on what your backstop is, or you're in San Diego. I think there's probably not a safe area to shoot in your backyard, a place like that. But we don't know the full details of exactly what the setup was here. But it's a little weird to hear that being the basis for a red flag law, the usage of the red flag order, because generally those are meant for people who are clearly demonstrating that they're a threat to themselves or others. That is supposed to be the idea. And I suppose you could argue somebody shooting in their backyard in a populated area is a threat to other people out of sort of carelessness or negligence. But that is, it is interesting to see it used this way in regards to a red flag order, right? Because we've associated those with either people who are suicidal or potentially, mass shooters. That's the conversation around them. But this use case is obviously something that is, I think, in there, like you alluded to, with the concerns that a lot of program people have with these kind of orders, because there's just kind of, maybe this guy was breaking the law, but seems like an expansion of the intended purpose to red flag him. And then, yeah, he was, I guess, convicted of violating the order because he didn't turn over the guns, or the gun. So I don't know. It's certainly a strange thing. And I think he got a pretty light punishment. I think it ended up being,
they said it was a misdemeanor, and yeah, it was probation and community service. But yeah, still the fact that the fact that that's how it played out.
It's a very odd use of the law, I think.
Yeah, but I think that's right.
So, and the first time I've ever heard of something quite like that for red flag laws, and like you said, I think it gets to the core of why people are skeptical. A lot of program people are skeptical of these proposals.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, people maybe are sympathetic to trying to prevent mass shooters, but as a jurisdiction like this that they point out uses this stuff frequently, maybe these are the kind of use cases that end up making up the bulk of that use.
Yeah, I mean, the cops show up at your house because your neighbors complain that it's basically a noise complaint. You're shooting a gun. Maybe that is illegal, but you should then be prosecuted under that statute, not a red flag. It seems odd to use a red flag order in this circumstance. It seems like a shortcut, right, around having to deal with whatever they would have to do to prove the discharging a firearm crime, discharging a firearm in a populated area crime. So yeah, that's one of the main concerns, that these things will be used as kind of shortcuts, that the judges will just issue them whenever they're requested, because they'll be afraid to not issue them and let some person end up becoming a mass shooter. These are common criticisms you hear, and I think this case will be one that gets cited among those criticisms moving forward.
Yeah, certainly.
But hey, I think that's all we got for this week. You got any good plans for the weekend?
So I actually got sick last weekend, so I wasn't able to do the sort of wedding planning that I was trying to do. So that'll be this weekend instead, going to tour some venues and that sort of thing. So that'll be my weekend. Nice. Yeah. And you're going to be touring in Colorado. I imagine there's a lot of nice venues for getting married there. Yes. A couple mountain areas. We're about 30-ish minutes away from the foothills, where you start getting into really, really pretty country. So gonna go look at some venues, some ranches, and that sort of thing. Nice. Yeah, I'm gonna try and catch up on sleep. I was up at the farm watching the horses last week, right? And so my body I think this may be a thing getting older. Your body, I got used to getting up early to feed the horses, and I found it hard to go, not wake up at that time. Which is kind of rough, because I usually try to get 8 hours, and I don't know. So that's my main goal this weekend. Try to catch up, get back to my normal sleep schedule. So I have big, ambitious plans, as you could tell. Yeah. But we'll see if I can accomplish it or not. I did the charity shoot for Homes for Our Troops. That's coming up in a week. So I'm looking forward to that too, doing that shoot with the person who won the auction last year, and look forward to doing that auction again later this year. Always a good time and for a good cause. You guys should check out Homes for Our Troops if you haven't already. Great charity. They build homes for, as you might guess, disabled troops, people who are combat disabled, and they build them specialized homes. So always happy to participate with that. But that's my main thing that I'm looking forward to coming up here in the next week. This weekend, just trying to get back to that good sleep schedule. We'll see if I can do it. I'll report back. All right. That's all we've got for you this week. We will see you guys again real soon. If you want to support the work we're doing here at The Reload, you can head over to thereload.com and buy a membership today. That is how we fund our operations. And of course, if you buy a membership, you will get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of news and analysis you won't get anywhere else, and the opportunity to appear on the podcast. So if you want to be on the podcast, if you're a member, just reach out. Your exclusive Sunday newsletter for members, it's another perk. Just reply to that and we'll have you on. But that's all we've got for you. We will see you guys again real soon.
No, the devil's got no